Datasheets are the backbone of PCB design work, serving as a vital reference for every component we use. However, with hundreds, sometimes even thousands of pages to comb through, the process can be time-consuming, making it a great candidate for an AI tool. In a previous video, we introduced you to Flux Copilot, the first AI hardware design assistant. Copilot can now sift through hundreds of pages of datasheet information in a few seconds, leaving you free to focus on the creative aspects of PCB design. Let's see how it works. To make sure Copilot can pull the datasheet for your component, the first thing you need to check is that your component has a property called datasheet URL and it has a link to a URL. If it doesn't, like this transistor over here, you can just copy and paste the URL for the datasheet. As soon as that is validated, you can ask Copilot any question and have it read the datasheet for you. When you're finished typing your question, Copilot will tell you that it's reading datasheets. That is the first cue to make sure that Copilot is actually reading the datasheet for your component and is not pulling information from the outside world. But what does that mean? Copilot has two main sources of information. One is the datasheet that is linked from the property, and the other one is the wider information that's available in the world. Information from the datasheet ensures that the answer that Copilot can give is the most accurate one. Apart from having the datasheet URL, there are other things that you need to keep in mind to make sure that Copilot can read the datasheet. The first one is that you need to target one specific component for each question. For example, you cannot ask Copilot to run multiple queries for multiple components at the same time. What you need to do in that case is ask multiple questions, one for each component. If you don't see the reading datasheet message, it means that Copilot is pulling information from the outside world and not specifically from this datasheet. When Copilot is done reading the datasheet, it will give you references to point you back to your original datasheet to where you can find more information about that specific question. So now let's find out how we can use this information to have Copilot wire schematics for us. As I mentioned before, if we ask Copilot about multiple components in a single prompt, it will not prioritize the datasheet information and will instead use the wider pool of information. Under these conditions, it can do something pretty great though. As an example, let's try the sensor from the canvas. And we can ask Copilot how we can connect U2 to the Raspberry Pi 2040. Now Copilot's answer is pretty detailed. It's showing us all the connections that we need to do, and it's also showing us that we need some other components, for example, current limiting resistors. The interesting thing here comes at the end. There's this take action button that as soon as we click, we'd automatically create all the connections that we need to connect our sensor to the microcontroller. It usually does a pretty good job at connecting things together, but one thing that you need to keep in mind is that Copilot cannot yet add components to the canvas. So in this case, remember that Copilot told us that we needed a current limiting resistor, but you don't see the current limiting resistor here. In these cases, make sure that you go back to Copilot's answer, find all the components that you need to place, and place them after Copilot has done the connections. And let's see what else Copilot can do for us. The other thing Copilot can do for us is help us learn how to use Flux. Since Copilot has full access to Flux documentation, we can ask any questions about how Flux works or how to accomplish certain tasks. For example, we can ask Copilot how to create a custom symbol. If you paid attention, you could see that Copilot told us that it was reading Flux documentation. That means that Copilot would prioritize Flux documentation in order to create this answer. In this answer, we can see that Copilot explains us how we can create a custom symbol by creating an NVG file, importing, linking the asset, etc. Another important aspect is that Flux will add links for all the references where it took information from. So you can click on any of these and find more information if you want. Now let's see what happens if Copilot is taking information from the Flux documentation or datasheets and you were expecting it to do something else. So let's recap what we learned so far. Copilot can either pull information from datasheets, it can wire components together, or it can access Flux documentation to teach you how to use Flux. What you need to understand is that Copilot uses different sources of information for all these different questions. So for example, you might be expecting Copilot to read a datasheet, but it's not doing that. In that case, as we mentioned, make sure that you're only targeting one single component and that component has a datasheet linked. If instead you're trying to use Copilot to wire the schematic for you, make sure that you explicitly mention the two components that you want to connect together. In this case, U1 and U2. And finally, if you're trying to learn how to use Flux, make sure that you ask Copilot how to do something specifically in Flux. This is very important to understand when you're evaluating Copilot's response. In most cases, just by optimizing the prompt and making sure that you explicitly tell Copilot what you're looking for, it will help you make the more accurate decision in terms of what information to pull from.